record. Okay, you might all have to agree to allow yourselves to be recorded there. Okay, great. All right, so as I said, I'm Patty Lombard, and I have a couple of colleagues here. We are organizing, we're convening this conversation tonight, and I represent both the Larchmont Blvd Association as well as the Larchmont Buzz. I've lived here for a long time. I hate to say how long, but I've also been doing the Buzz for 10 years. Liz and I are going to be celebrating the 10th anniversary later this summer, so we're excited about that. I think what I'd like to do is I'll have a chance to tell you a little bit more about Larchmont, but I think what I'll do is I'll introduce some of my partners here who are helping convene this conversation as well. Heather, you ready?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Heather Duffy Boylston. I'm a fourth generation Angelino. I've been coming to Larchmont Village my entire life, but I've lived here for 20 years. I bought my first house here and have never left. I represent the property owners on Larchmont, and the property owners really welcome this opportunity to come together in unison with the merchants and the neighborhood association and all of you, the community. It's really important to us to talk about Larchmont in the best way moving forward. We want to support the merchants that we have, and we want to attract new businesses that the neighborhood wants to see there. So we are just happy that we're all coming together to have this conversation.
All right.
Next. Hi,
Gary Gilbert.
Hi, I'm Gary Gilbert. I have been part of this neighborhood for 35 years. I am here as a member of the Windsor Square Association, which represents 1,100 families surrounding Larchmont Boulevard, including many of you here today. Like everyone on the Zoom, I have a strong connection to Larchmont. I volunteered here to ensure that it remains a vibrant, diverse, fully occupied, clean, safe street that serves our local community and beyond. I also wanted to thank both Patty and John for their expertise into the process, and especially want to thank my friend Heather Boylston and the other members of the Larchmont Village BID, because this dialogue would be seriously hindered if we didn't have the full support of the building owners as we together address the future. I'm both excited and optimistic that we can and will make a difference.
Great.
Thank you.
Gary, thank you so much. I'm John Kaliski. I was really excited when Patty called me up and said, hey, John, can you help me think about this a little bit? I've lived in Larchmont, or not in Larchmont, I've lived in Windsor Village for 35 years. The first place I ever ate a meal 35 years ago was at the Cafe Chapeau on Larchmont Boulevard, and I've gone there probably every day since for 35 years. I'm an architect and urban designer. I've had the privilege of working on projects of this type, including with Rob and Andrew, who I have a lot of respect for. I also have been on various civic committees, and right now I'm the architect member of the Country Club Park, Oxford Square, Wilshire Park, Windsor Village Historic Preservation Overlay Zone, and I'm really thrilled to be participating, and it's great to see so many familiar faces have joined us tonight. So why don't we go on to the next slide. Tonight we're going to try to do a lot of things all at once. I think what the operative word for us is conversation. We want to have a conversation about Larchmont. We have some goals and objectives, which Gary and Heather and Patrick and I have talked about, which Gary started to describe a little bit. We'll go into those. Patty's going to give you a little bit of an introduction to Larchmont Village, since she wrote the book on the history of Larchmont Village. We're going to try to describe as clearly as we can the framework that controls the types of uses that are allowed on the boulevard and the types of buildings that are allowed on the boulevard. We have some real experts in the room here on that, I know, and I'm certainly looking forward to your correcting us if we get any of it wrong. We're then going to pause for 10 or so minutes and say, hey, do any of you have any comments or questions? We'll talk about how to get those in front of us in just a moment. We're then going to move on to our speaker presentations. Rob York and Andrew Thomas both have tremendous local experience as well as national experience on retail trends, main streets, business improvement districts. We want to hear from them, like what's going on What should we be thinking about? I'll then ask them some hopefully pointed questions that will rile them up, and they may try to rile us up. And then we're going to open it up to everybody. Gary and Heather are going to be collecting comments, and we'll end the evening talking about next steps. In terms of the meeting, we want to make this meeting work. Here's a picture of the Three Stooges convening on Larchmont Boulevard when the train was still, or the streetcar was still running up and down it. We are at the beginning of a process. Heather, Gary, and Patricia and I, Patty and I, we did not feel it was appropriate to just come up with recommendations. We felt it was incredibly important to first have a conversation, listen to what other people outside of our direct sphere thought about, and then working with the community, come back with ideas. So this is really about listening first. In the process of this, we really want to have a civil conversation. We want to respect all opinions, no matter where they're coming from. We want to entertain as many ideas as possible and have as many input opportunities as possible. We know that some people aren't comfortable with these types of forums, that they don't feel comfortable expressing their ideas. So if you have an idea or you have a reaction to what we're doing or thought about how to make Larchmont better, but you're not comfortable sharing them in the chat tonight or talking tonight or at any other point, send them to Patty at larchmontbuzz.com. We're going to try to respond to as many things as we can. But tonight, our mechanism, because we're not all in a room together, is Zoom. Zoom is not always the easiest tool to work with. And so we thought we would just sort of spend 2 seconds talking about what do you do with Zoom? Well, first of all, we're recording this session. You've all agreed to that. That is another good reason to be as civil as we possibly can be. But if you want to participate in the chat or let people know that you'd like to say something, you need to first of all find, if you haven't done this before, find the chat button at the bottom of your screen. That's typically where it exists, though in some formats it occurs at the top. Push that button. It will then open up a bar on the right-hand side of your screen. You can enter in a comment or a question where it says 3 chat entry. It will appear. Everyone will see it. And what we're going to be doing is Heather and Gary are going to be compiling those comments. And when we get to the conversation, at least in the initial question and comments, they're going to let us know what people have been saying. And then when we get to the open discussion, we may invite people, if there are a lot of people here tonight, to go ahead and just open it up to everybody. If you want to do that, you'll raise your hand, which you do under reactions, which I forgot to circle. I'm sure some of you have done this before. Others will get the hang of it, and we'll try to get to as many of the comments as we can. We never expected that at this point. I think 100 people or so, something like that, have joined us. So we may be a bit overwhelmed, but we'll record everything and we'll try to respond. In terms of the next slide. Let's get there. So what are our goals and objectives? Well, first of all, as Gary, I thought, more eloquently put it, we want to start a conversation to explore means, especially short-term methods, to support existing businesses and foster new neighborhood-oriented retail, as well as enhance Larchmont Boulevard. There have been a lot of great efforts, some of which are even continuing today to do that, but all of us recognize that there are certain challenges about the street, and we want to sort of explore ways to keep the street working and make it as sustainable as possible. In terms of these meetings, especially the first 2 meetings that we're going to be holding, we want to try to create some opportunities to learn about best Main Street and neighborhood retail practices. Learn from both local as well as national examples. We want to use these conversations, especially our 3rd conversation towards the end of July, to collect improvement ideas. We want to develop, in the long run, a working consensus and come back with some next steps to the community and say, why don't we consider these? But most of all, we want to start and encourage a neighborhood dialogue and find ways of creating positive input and constructive ideas to create a sustainable Larchmont Village future that all of us will be able to continue to enjoy. So with that, in terms of the goals and objectives, I'll turn it back to Patty, who will give us a little introduction on where we've been and what we've been doing for the last almost 100 years, because this is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the street.
Exactly. Thanks, John. So I am going to share with you a few slides from the book, Larchmont, A Pictorial History of Larchmont Boulevard, which was published in 2015. And here's the self-promotion part. Is available from our favorite bookseller, Chevalier's Books. It was published by Arcadia Press, and I know a lot of you actually already have it, so thank you for that. Bert, thanks you. And when you're there, you can buy some more books. The photograph behind me is Larchmont from the 1950s, which I believe was part of the archives of the Larchmont Chronicle. So thanks to John Wellborn and Jane Gilman for sharing some of their wonderful photos. In my research for the book, I learned that Larchmont was originally called Glenwood. And then sometime around 1912, according to the city archivist, the name was changed to Larchmont. Really not exactly sure why, but the most common explanation is that it was probably named after Larchmont, New York, a residential village in Westchester County. And Heather and I participated in a kind of Larchmont East-West. Remember, a lot of you participated in that too. We did a little retail challenge at Christmas time. So Larchmont, New York is alive and well, as is Larchmont Boulevard. At the time that Larchmont was founded, between 1900 and 1920, the population of the city of Los Angeles literally exploded. It was about 100,000 people lived here in 1900, and it grew to over 500,000 people in 1920. The image that you see on the screen is that development happening. This is an aerial photo from the 1920s from the UCLA Geography School archive. So that had a profound impact on Los Angeles. I also wanted to point out that it was developed by Jules Labonte and Charles Ramson. They were neighborhood developers who had also done some successful homes and commercial properties. In 1921, on September 25th, the LA Times reported that a new business district of 30 stores was planned for Larchmont Boulevard between First Street and Beverly Boulevard. And you can see that yellow box right there. This is the general area that we were talking about. And you can see in those days, they were pretty prescient to see that the neighborhood would grow up and would need a commercial district. At that time, developers paid to bring the transportation to the neighborhoods they were developing. And those red dotted lines are the rail lines for the Los Angeles Railway. And this was railway line number 3. And there's a lot of railway enthusiasts who've shared with us some photographs, which we've published in the Buzz over the years. But it was a great way for people to go from 3rd Street North up to Melrose to the Hollywood Mineral Hot Springs, and Labonte and Ransom took advantage of that. They installed light posts on the railway lights, the railway poles, and so created an illuminated section of the city, which was very beneficial. As a result, all of the stores were leased before the construction was finished. A developer's dream come true, right? Labonte saw Larchmont as a place that would be a service street for the neighborhood. He always envisioned it as a neighborhood serving shopping area. According to his daughter, Charlotte, in an interview to the Larchmont Chronicle in 1991, she said, "It was planned as the first neighborhood shopping center in Los Angeles. Labonte planned for a theater, a bank, a grocery store, a drugstore, a bakery, a dry cleaners, and a candy store. And he was always looking for continuity in the businesses on the street. He knew that customers would come back to the same locations, and he tried to make sure there was something for everyone there on the street. He designed it so that the stores were attractive. The buildings were colored, pressed, ornamental stucco work, and you can see that in some of these pictures here. And they were furnished with the modern mercantile conveniences. Over time, the changes have been made to these buildings on the street. You can see that top row of photographs is a photograph from the 1930s and then the 1960s, and a present day photo of the same building, which looks dramatically different. Not all of the changes were for the better, but they were definitely modified over the years. In addition to the queue conditions, which govern the uses on the street, which John's going to talk about in a few minutes, there are some restrictions on development. There is a 35-foot height limit on the buildings and a 5-foot setback, and no individual business may exceed 50 linear feet. This was an ordinance passed to address concerns of the neighborhood at the time. In 1997, actually, John, we have to correct that date there. It was proposed by Councilmember Tom LaBonge to preserve the village atmosphere of the neighborhood. LaBonge described it as Larchmont is the physical and social, as well as the retail center for the surrounding neighborhoods of Larchmont, Hancock Park, and Windsor Square. And we certainly feel that today with all of you here, showing evidence that it is such an important street. That's it for me, and I think that's a great segue to more discussion on the queue conditions from John. John, you have to unmute, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we talk about the Qs, the Ds, and the clarifications that serve as the planning framework for the street when new businesses want to come in, or if somebody wanted to come in and build a new building. Basically, I think one has to start that as long as there is memory in this room, there have been conversations about what makes a street, and Larchmont Boulevard in particularly, work. And people have been involved in that. And this latest round of conversations, you could say, is Larchmont 3.0 or Larchmont 5.0. You'd have to sort of do a history of the street. But there have been, for 35 years at least, conversations about how do you basically make the street a neighborhood-oriented retail street, not have it be overrun by big businesses or special purpose businesses, things of that nature. There's been always a lot of interest to make sure that there are neighborhood-oriented retail uses along the street. At various times, there were concerns about financial and real estate uses. There was concern that they were very popular in the 80s and the early 90s, and that they would potentially create a business district as opposed to a neighborhood-oriented retail street. There have been at times concerns about food service, restaurants and takeout uses, and regulations have been passed to try to shape the street to ensure that there would be a balance and a mix of uses on the street that serve the neighborhood well. At times, people were concerned about parking, and a public parking structure was built underground at the Rite Aid with city support. There have been ongoing conversations about trees and sidewalks, medians. Some of you worked on getting the medians that are there right now because they ripped out the trains, and for what, 30, 40 years, it was just a big, wide open, sunny place. Alcohol at times has been a conversation. Folks have proposed open space ideas and continue to have open space ideas. In the last year and a half, the street has gone through some interesting times, and the businesses in particular have been challenged by the pandemic, the rise of online shopping, and as an emergency measure, the city adapted the dining parklets. What's the future of the dining parklets? Should they stay exactly as is? Should they open up some of the parking spaces? All of these challenges have existed over this time. They still exist today, and that was part of what I think Patty and Heather and I and Gary got together and started saying, well, how do we address them for the next decade or the next 2 decades? Well, there's always been a community response. Some of that community response has been these so-called Qs, Ds, and clarifications, and now we're into a new one. So in order to discuss that, let me try to give you a couple of basics about the ordinances. In 1992, Patty, the original ordinance was in fact passed. I think there have always been conversations which continued even into 1997. And that established the current qualified conditions, which really still regulate certain types of uses on the street. Everything between First Street and Melrose Avenue was given a Q condition, and between 3rd Street and Melrose Avenue was given a Q condition, and between First to Beverly there were additional conditions imposed to ensure that there would be a full range of neighborhood retail uses. What in essence the city, working with the community, did was they took what were generally the neighborhood uses, which were under the C1 designation, and they allowed them to continue to exist in Larchmont, plus select C2 uses. So in essence, if you think of these zoning codes as a big list of uses, people went through all the uses, they generally concentrated on the ones that were neighborhood oriented, and they said that's what would be allowed in Larchmont. But there were some challenges, which was why they were doing this in the first place. As I mentioned a moment ago, there was concern that financial services, which included banks and real estate offices, were proliferating, and so the Q conditions limited those. They limited those by saying you could have a maximum of one for every 300 feet, not necessarily on that spacing, but if you took the total frontage in Larchmont, which is around 2,700 feet, it resulted in a maximum of 9 financial uses, service uses that could be deployed along the street. Included within the definition of financial services were real estate offices, and those were limited to one for every 900 feet, though not necessarily spaced that way, which meant that of those total 9 uses, a maximum of 3 of them could be real estate offices. Each of those uses that we've talked about in terms of financial services are limited to, if they're new, to 60 feet of frontage, which means a total of 540 feet could be devoted to this type of use. And there was a recognition that at that time there might need to be some ability for some of those uses to expand, so the ordinance specifically allowed for their expansion on second floors. Similar types of rules were established for restaurant uses. In the case of restaurant uses, they were limited to one for every 270 feet of frontage, though you could have them next to each other. It's just that the maximum number of restaurants that could be allowed was 10. The maximum width of a new restaurant was limited to 40 feet, and the total frontage for restaurants was limited to 200 feet, which sets up a fairly interesting formula as opposed to an exact number of restaurants that were allowed. If over time restaurants evolved towards larger restaurants that always maximized the frontage, you would be limited to 5. If in fact, as happened, you have less frontage for each restaurant, the maximum would be 10. However, what was not totally clear in the original 1992 ordinance was what constituted a restaurant. And as time went on, takeouts began to appear more and more often. So in 2015, people in the neighborhood went back to the city with ideas about how to clarify what was a restaurant or an on-premise use versus what was a takeout service or an off-site use. And the planning department issued an official interpretation of the restaurant uses which clarified that, or at least tried to clarify that. And what they did was they defined a restaurant as a food service establishment for the on-premise consumption of food, and they said that, or it says in the interpretation, that if the majority of the square footage is used for on-premise consumption of food, then by definition it is a restaurant. If the majority of square footage in the space is not used for the on-premise consumption of food, then it becomes a food service establishment or a takeout that allows for off-site. All the other Q conditions still remained, but what it meant was that there was now a way for food service establishments that were takeouts to open that would increase the number theoretically of places selling food, if you count both restaurants as well as takeout places, to more than that 5 to 10 number that you've seen. And I know that in 2007, there was a very strong attempt to try to document everything, and a total of 27 food service establishments were noted at that particular date. And today even, I think that depending upon what day you go there are different numbers, but it's certainly more than 10 if you lump everything together. Folks in Larchmont have always been interested in what the street looks like. Now remember, what Patty presented was that one developer or two developers had a vision. They built all the initial buildings. They had a common set of rules that they followed. But I think people were concerned that over time, as more and more different property owners were involved, they wanted to ensure that the integrity of the street as a neighborhood-oriented retail street was maintained. So in 2018, complementing the Q conditions, the city passed in ordinance form what are called D conditions or development standards. The D stands for development, sometimes for design. So there are a bunch of development standards that apply to the street from First Street to Beverly Boulevard again. It defines that the front yard, the buildings have to face that front yard, is Larchmont Boulevard. It defines that storefront designs can be a maximum of 50 feet long, which I think Patty mentioned a moment ago, but they also have to be a minimum of 25 feet deep. The shop fronts and the storefronts and the frontages all need to be pedestrian oriented. They need to have their entries facing the sidewalk. And there are some further calls for building articulation and screening, particularly screening of automobiles set back from the street. With new construction, no surface parking would be allowed. There are also some landscape and architectural treatment provisions within the D conditions, mainly to try to relate new construction better to the adjoining single-family residential neighborhoods. There are some provisions which restrict signage a little bit over and above what's in the Los Angeles zoning code. And as Patty mentioned, there's a maximum height of 35 feet should somebody try to build a new building. At this point, we're going to take a pause. I'm going to turn it over to Gary and Heather and see if there have been any comments or questions about what we're doing here tonight, or how we're doing it, or the history of the street, or the Q and D conditions. We'll spend about 10 minutes or so at the most, and then we'll get into our presentations from Rob and Andrew.
Well, shockingly, we don't have any questions yet, but I think that everybody can, from that presentation, I do think that everybody understands that it is a little bit complicated what we're talking about, right? And there's a lot to unpack so that everybody understands what these Qs and Ds are. So unless anybody wants to raise their hand or put any questions in the chat, we can just continue on with the presentation perhaps and take more questions at the end.
That's fine with me. I mean, that leaves us more time. We just wanted to make sure that people were fully up to speed about why we're here, what our goals and objectives are, but I don't see those reactions. So let's move forward into the presentations. Okay, we're really lucky tonight that we have two great speakers. Our first presenter is going to be Rob York. Rob York runs a company called York Consulting in Los Angeles. They are a real estate development consulting firm. They specialize in retail. They've done a lot of work in terms of downtown and business district revitalization. Rob is a real expert at market positioning for retail districts. He dives into tenant mix analysis, like what makes a successful street in terms of the types of businesses that need to be there. He has done deep dives into trade areas, demographics, competitive analysis. He's worked all over the country, but some of his projects include he's worked on downtown Santa Monica, 3rd Street Promenade, the Rincon Center in San Francisco. He's involved, or has been involved, in the Port of Los Angeles and their waterfront development plans. And he's collaborated with Andrew on the Westwood Village bid plans over the last 10 years or so. So Rob, we really have three key questions that we wanted to ask you tonight. And really just off the cuff from your experience and perspective, which is, what's impacting neighborhood retail now? I mean, what should we as a community be thinking about when we look at our street? What type of retail trends are shaping successful main streets in the future? We've heard a lot about online competition, changes in what people want to buy on streets, things of that nature. Are there things that we should know about that you see that we should be particularly sensitive to? And I know that you visited Larchmont because I walked up and down the street with you and Patty, and we had a great conversation. We even met some of the tenants on the street. What are your takeaways as somebody who does this on a daily basis but has no vested interest in the street? So with that, I'll turn it over to you, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Sure, great. Well, I appreciate the setup and the all the participants here, but certainly Larchmont is a really great, unique neighborhood, and there aren't a lot of areas that can support or have maintained this quality of district. So I think there's obviously there's a lot to work with, and I worked all around the country as John referenced, and it's there are a lot of things that people are trying to build into their projects or into their district revitalizations that mimic many of the aspects that that you have already in Larchmont Village. So, obviously we're just emerging from what's hopefully been a once in a lifetime experience with the pandemic. And, as has been well said over and over again, it's really accelerated some changes that we already saw. Certain trends really took hold and the pace quickened in certain changes. But it's also changed other larger considerations. And one of the advantages of neighborhood serving retail areas and certainly Larchmont Village is it is a different environment. It has a level of charm and history that cannot be replicated. You also don't have it wasn't built on super density, right? It's built on a modestly scaled surrounding residential area. It's not dependent on office high rises, which are now even still largely vacant in many business districts. So you're not feeling that kind of daytime missing piece of your normal trade area. But what's happened is, a lot of the traditional mainstream retail chains and independents have been hammered. And some of that is based on online competition, which is just getting cheaper, better, more convenient. They know more about you. They get to your wallet before you even know you have a desire in some cases. And that's really changed the dynamic. So what has happened to many of these larger, more regional serving districts is, they're forced to take a much more substantial rethink that I think Larchmont Village will need to do. But as more kind of traditional retail will shrink over time, food and beverage, different and more interesting services, entertainment where it can be supported, and really unique niche and specialty retail. You've got some great local retailers already in the village, but there's certainly room for more. And as we fully start to heal from COVID, there's going to be certainly a renaissance in dining and in select retail categories. That's going to be some interesting opportunities. But the risk to small businesses is not over. Many of them are still struggling. They still have a financial hangover from the past year and a half. Rising costs, labor challenges, access to capital, all those things are still weighing on many smaller entrepreneurs as well as certain landlords. So we have to be cognizant that there's there's still some shared pain out there for sure. When you talk specifically about Larchmont Village, again, the environment, the history creates a very charming, hard to replicate experience for people, which makes you a little bit more resistant to the whims of market changes. It's got a nice intimate scale. It's very neighborhood friendly. There's a diversity of the architecture. It doesn't look like it was all built overnight. The demographics are amazing, right? Nobody could ask for much better than what you've got in terms of your local trade area. The spaces are very well scaled. They're not too large. They're not too deep. That's been a huge challenge for many districts and even some newer projects, which were looking for the very large scale, retail and other uses. So that creates a nice core of a very defensible and hopefully, it's obviously has 100 years of longevity. And I think there's many decades to come where this is going to work well. Some of the challenges, not all the buildings are great. You've got some amazing buildings, some that have unfortunately been remodeled in an unfriendly way, as Patty pointed out. And you do have some zoning restrictions, some of which may have helped maintain the character of the district, but it's always a challenge of, preventing the bad versus allowing the good. And it's very likely you're going to have to revisit some of your queue conditions and other things to allow for greater flexibility so that the street can continue to adapt to, changing consumer tastes and changing viable tenants. Looking at the liquor issue, that's a huge challenge, I know, for many people. I don't think you want to become a bar zone, but to have one or two high quality restaurants with full service seems like I know you've got a couple that are doing a very nice job, but you don't really have, the meaningful depth in dining that I think that area could support, and I think the locals would enjoy, as long as it was, appropriately scaled. And I would probably search for an independent, but just generically thinking something on the lines of what a Hillstone would do, like a R&D kitchen, a small scale, nice grill with a bar, something like that. Anyway, some of the other challenges are, the need to adapt, right? So it's great that you've got smaller spaces, but the nature of leases are changing, and that's hard on many of the smaller independent mom and pop landlords. Leases are getting shorter. In many cases, tenants are expecting a greater investment in the retail space than has been typical. And if you've gone for decades without having to consider that, it can be a shock to the system. So, that's going to be a challenge. And a lot of the businesses that are expanding right now, at least on the more national scale, are not the uses that you really want in Larchmont Village, right? It's, what's hot, off-price retail and drive-through restaurants and ghost kitchens and all the things you don't want in Larchmont Village. So you have to be much more selective and really curate the space and work with your landlords and try and create that local, unique feel and level of service that I think the community is looking for. But, home goods, services, niche boutiques, even in the case of Larchmont, I think you could, if it was desirable, invite some digitally native retailers to do, stores that are, they're tend to be more like showrooms, but still, branded emerging brands, because you've got small spaces and great demographics. You could add that to add some flavor to the mix. Health and wellness, fitness. It's always a trick with smaller spaces when you get into uses like fitness, but there are some good small boutique kind of uses. And that also affects some of your parking considerations. But that is, those are the kind of uses that are gaining prevalence and often have a very good, strong local following. Other things that can be done, but they're tricky for smaller landlords, are more temporary stores and pop-ups, which can add flavor and keep the place changing. But it's a lot of work, frankly. It requires more management, and sometimes it's easier to do a multi-year lease than to do something that's 3 months or 6 months or even a year. So. And there's always the challenge of multiple ownerships, right? It's, in some ways, it's very easy to have a singular ownership and vision, and you can really work the tenant mix and make a great deal for that tenant you really love, and charge some other folks a little bit more and balance it out and make sure that the investments in the public space are up to speed. But that's not what you're working with. And in many ways, single ownership can also stifle the creativity that helps, really give an area an authentic feel. So there's pluses and minuses to that. Some of the other challenges, and I'll get to opportunities here really quick, but Larchmont is a small area. It has limited resources. And so, when you're up against the larger draw of some very big players who are on the fringes of your trade area, who can market, who can run special events, who can essentially buy tenants if they find that's desirable, that's a challenge. But a lot of these big areas have been slower to adapt. It's not always about money. And you just have to have a little more focus and creativity. So, when getting back to what the opportunities might be, I think one of the great things that's come out of the pandemic, frankly, is the more creative use of public space. I think the dining areas on the street, although, to be honest, Larchmont hasn't done the best presentation of that I've seen, a little too temporary. But it's a great way to support the dining and create vibrancy and send a signal to people, whether they're walking through or driving through, that, there's something going on here. And it really does help support more than nighttime business. And I think there's a nighttime opportunity that's probably missed in the village a little bit, that I think could be really lovely, frankly. Something that probably most people would not like, but I think might be interesting if you had an opportunity, tied to a restaurant, is maybe a rooftop, low slung, nicely covered from the neighbors, but a roof deck experience. It doesn't have to be at the 30th story of a hotel in Hong Kong. It can be on a second floor and just overlooking a nice leafy street. So can you program this space better? I know you've got a farmer's market. Could you, upgrade and make those outdoor dining areas permanent? Could you have a neighborhood block party once a year or once a quarter? I'd really try and keep it local, and local in the sense that it's so great that the locals want to invite people from the wider region, but it's really got that local feeling to it. Some of the public space is not in great shape. You've got some issues on some of the on some of the sidewalks, and so I would see doing some sidewalk repairs, some better lighting, just minor interventions get you a huge return on investment. Parking is everybody's bugaboo. I'm surprised it isn't number one on every list, but I would just say the world is changing, and yes, the pandemic threw a wrench in on-demand car services, but I would say, you should fully embrace that and maybe even create a little pickup and drop off zone, because, that's going to take a lot of pressure off your parking. And that's the way, the younger generation wants to do it. And frankly, if you're out for a night, it's just super convenient, even if you're just a quarter mile away. So what else would I do from a planning standpoint? Well, I would think about your corners, right? It's a great little strip. Your corners, the terms I'm thinking about, but they're not strong. Okay, you don't have great uses, and so I would plan. It may not happen for decades, frankly, but I would plan for better uses at the corners, because even across from your immediate corners, you have dry cleaner and a Chipotle, and you got plenty of banks, too many banks. That kind of stuff takes a long time, especially when you have a lot of stakeholders. But I would think about what those corners could be, being sensitive to some of them, flow right into residential neighborhoods, but there's a lot of upside, and that's really your front door. So I'd be thinking about that. But I'd say the big picture is you've got a lot of the fundamental bones that you would design into into a district if you're doing it today. Yes, there's things you would change, but you've got some very good fundamental characteristics, and you are far less vulnerable than many other districts and many private retail projects in the region, because it was well considered from day one, and it didn't expand beyond a reasonable level of support. So yes, there's a lot of upside. Yes, there's certainly some triage and some things you can do in the near term, but you're scoring pretty high. So I would feel confident, but I would try and build a consensus to allow some more flexibility and make some not huge dollar, but some significant, improvements to the public space.
Fantastic. I don't think I'm muted right now. Thank you so much, Rob. I'm sure we'll get back to you in a few minutes, but what I'm going to do now is reshare the screen and introduce Andrew Thomas to everybody, and then invite Andrew to talk to us for a few minutes. Andrew is the executive director of the Westwood Village Improvement Association. For those of you who are wonky and follow these types of things, you'll know that a lot of the issues that we talk about in Larchmont are similarly talked about in Westwood, but they have a much bigger business district and a university right next to them, which complicates things. Westwood Village Improvement Association is a nonprofit business improvement district. It's similar to the one that we have, though it has a much bigger budget and serves many, almost 10 times as many properties. The Westwood Village Improvement Association does take positions on short-term as well as long-term opportunities and policies. They're down at City Hall a lot. I'm sure that Andrew will talk about that. Over the years, they've worked on crosswalks, specific plan input, parking policies, design policies. Andrew's done it all because he's been there for over 10 years. Before he was at Westwood Village, he was the former director of operations at the Bayside District Corp., which is in essence the 3rd Street Promenade or downtown Santa Monica. And Andrew, we want to ask you exactly the same 3 questions. Based on your experience in Westwood and in Santa Monica and other areas, what's impacting neighborhood retail now? What are the trends that we should be thinking about that are shaping the future? And having looked at Larchmont, what are your takeaways? What do you think the opportunities are? And with that, I'll stop the share of my screen and turn it over to you.
Thanks, John, and thanks to you all for having me here this evening. It's a pleasure. I did feel like I was looking in a mirror because Westwood Village and Larchmont Village have some similarities and certainly some of the same challenges. Just a little bit about what some of those similarities might be. Both our districts have business improvement districts, like John mentioned. Our budget is about $1.5 million. We have board members, primarily property owners in our districts. Our key constituencies would be in no particular order. UCLA, they're the 800-pound gorilla in our district. Their daytime population is somewhere around 85,000 people, and that's faculty, employees, staff, and people at the hospital. And they expect to be fully back in the fall, sort of at their post-pandemic numbers. We have about 6 million plus square feet of high-rise office space. Some of it is still empty, but it's coming back somewhat. We'll see if it comes back in the same way. Those are important patrons in our district. And then we have a lot of residential around our districts and very affluent housing. Bel Air to the north. I wouldn't exactly call them users of the village, but you get the idea. We have a lot of residential renter units, people that are students in the North Village, and then also to the south of us, probably young professionals in the West Side area. Our bid was formed, I think, in response to a lot of things that you're talking about, but probably even more so to neglect. We're a bigger area. We're about 25 square blocks, and we were neglected by the city in terms of just really not having basic services that I think a lot of our citizens of the city had come to expect. But that's not unique to Westwood. I'd say that's probably an issue across the country as the public sector pulls back from providing services and the private sector has stepped in. But we also were neglected in terms of our business community wasn't speaking with one voice. And I really think that's such a key component for our commercial centers. In Westwood, decisions were being made about our commercial area by relatively small number of leaders in our homeowners association community. And while I completely understand their position in representing neighborhood communities, I'm not sure they had the understanding of the business community that we really needed in terms for our district to take the next step. Some of the things that we've done that I think will be relevant to today's conversation. We've done sidewalk reconstruction, we've done branding, wayfinding, we did a parking assessment documenting all of our parking in our district, and this has been helpful to informing our own policy decisions, but also informing the city's decisions as they embark on parking policies for our district and also for the city. We worked with Rob on a retail study. We work with Metro, the Purple Line extensions coming to our district in 2027. We're going to have 3 portals. We're pushing for Metro to invest in our district for the first last mile construction around those portals. But the most important thing we do, which I think really, John, goes to your questions, is advocacy and really speaking for our community. And this doesn't cost us anything. Most of our money goes to our clean and safe programs. We have ambassadors and they do maintenance and pressure washing and social service outreach. We trim trees, we landscape, we put lights in the trees, we do marketing and events and certain promotional efforts. But the advocacy piece, that doesn't cost us much, but it's so important to get your key stakeholders together to be able to speak to the city and your elected officials and also people in your community to try to get everybody really on the same page or as close to it as you can possibly get. We have our version of Q conditions in Westwood is what we call the Westwood Village Specific Plan. And it's a planning overlay. So it exists on top of what is already C4 zoning, which is C1 plus C2. So it's the most restrictive. So we have an overlay on top of what is already fairly restrictive zoning. Our organization has taken a position to eliminate the Westwood Village Specific Plan because we feel that it's really stymied us and prevented us from evolving. And as a 25 square block area, we have work to do, and you guys have advantages there that I'm envious of. I wish we could contract in some ways to have a smaller area. I think it would be easier to manage, and then some of our advantages I think would become more so if we had a smaller area. But we have what we have, and so that brings with it some of our own challenges. But we've asked our council member to amend our specific, to eliminate our specific plan. He won't do that, but he is open to amending it. So we've identified some areas specifically around food, and we have a crazy restaurant definition that is completely different than yours. And how the planning department can work with such different planning definitions of something like a restaurant is remarkable. And I think that probably speaks to the lack of enforcement that we see citywide, is that it's hard for the planning staff to really understand what they're dealing with from community to community. But we're looking to amend our plan for food, for parking requirements, which are out of whack, and also our signage approval process, which is really sort of a case study and a discretionary process, sort of gone off the rails a bit. We're also big in pushing the city to advocate for other important policy changes, creating a restaurant beverage program, which would make the approval of alcohol permits administrative, provided those restaurants meet certain criteria. And the criteria is pretty strict now, but we feel like this is an important step in helping our businesses in selling alcohol. I know that's an issue in your community. I completely understand it. We have frequent opposition to alcohol permits in our district as well, and it's a challenge overcoming those. But my response to that would be that, you know, alcohol is such an important economic driver for restaurants. For them to be able to sell really increases their profit margin, make them a better business, probably helps them service their customers better, who might have an expectation of being able to get a margarita at brunch or something like that. So the restaurant beverage program is something we've been pushing. And then I mentioned the discretionary process. The city's been looking at appeals and how it might be able to amend that process. Right now, for non-appellants, the cost of filing an appeal is less than 1% of what it costs the city. The cost for the actual applicant, the business owner, to file appeal is about 100% of the cost of the city. The only reason I would consider recommending increasing the cost of filing appeals is because the process, at least in our community, is that a handful of people, and when I say handful, I mean you can count them on less fingers than you have on your hand, are responsible for the overwhelming majority of appeals filed in our district. So the process has really gone a little bit sideways, and it can be challenging for businesses to open, and this has really earned us a reputation as being a challenging place to open businesses. We have some neighborhood dynamics that are challenging. Westwood is a place of many groups. We have 2 neighborhood councils, thanks to a recent subdivision election that was very contentious. We have a community council, we have HOAs that are incredibly influential in the process, and there's just many groups to talk to. So that's I want to give you just a foundation of what informs some of my thinking. As to your questions, John, I mean I couldn't agree more with Rob about so many things, if not everything. The pandemic has really accelerated what I view as a downward trend in brick and mortar retail sales. And I think we're seeing a shift towards more food and experiential uses as these really become, you know, the engines of our commercial districts. I think that most commercial districts are hurting now in some respect. And by hurting, I mean not just the businesses, but also the commercial property owners who may not have received rent in quite some time. I think the districts that are going to come back sooner, or that have come back now, are ones that have really leaned in to food uses, to experiential uses, and to maximizing the public right of way in the public realm. I'm really encouraged that the city of Los Angeles has now taken up, it's at the transportation committee now, making the alfresco dining permanent, at least for those businesses that want it. I couldn't agree more with the mayor, who said, you know, when your city's unofficial motto is 72 degrees and sunny, we really should be outside more. And I think that's one of the positives of the pandemic is people spending more time outside. It creates a vibrancy and an energy on the street that I think we can really capitalize on. Unfortunately for all of us, we exist in the city of Los Angeles. They are probably known for never being first. So we're following the footsteps of other areas and other cities within the county that are way more progressive and aggressive in attracting businesses. And I would point to what Santa Monica is doing in terms of making their process administrative and over the counter for businesses to come in, to quickly and easily sell alcohol, to really be free of parking requirements that I'm not sure do anything to add to the parking inventory. So cities like Santa Monica, Pasadena, you know, they've been really aggressive at attracting businesses, and I commend them for it. It's Los Angeles's loss, because these cities, as they aggressively seek out other businesses, they're luring those businesses from Los Angeles, and these cities have been really, you know, pushing their emergency ordinances while Los Angeles just finally passed its, last week, and it's not nearly as aggressive as these other cities. So I think as these businesses look at coming back, as entrepreneurs look to invest, they're going to be looking at places they can go where they have less restrictions, less expensive process, and a more predictable process that has far less brain damage. To specifically respond to what impacts neighborhood retail now, I would say destinations are really the key, and probably always have been. I'm going to date myself by quoting Bill Clinton's first presidential campaign. I remember he had the slogan and the bumper sticker, "It's the economy, stupid." I always feel like it's the destinations. And if you have those, people will figure it out, and they'll figure out parking, they'll figure out traffic. If you have destinations they want to visit, they'll find a way. In Westwood, we hear about parking all the time, despite the fact that at any given time of day, even during our peak occupancy times, there are over 1,000 available parking spaces for the public. But I still hear all the time that we have no parking in the village. The Hammer Museum put on an event a number of years ago where they filled vacant spaces with artists and artisans for a month. It was super, super cool. People came from all over the place. I didn't hear any complaining about parking. So again, I say it always goes back to the destinations. When I talk about issues with zoning, and I'm not always a fan, I look at areas in the city of Los Angeles that don't have the restrictions that Larchmont Village does and Westwood Village does. I frequently cite Sawtelle Boulevard, which is an area close to Westwood Village. It really shouldn't be a competitor, but all the businesses that we've rejected because they can't meet our specific plan requirements have gone there and become wildly successful. And what really bothers me is people who should be visiting Westwood Village are now going there. So people that probably would find it to be a closer walk to make it to the village would rather go to Sawtelle to visit some of their restaurants. So that's a problem. Zoning, I always say, it can't make the businesses you want appear. It can only prevent things from happening. You can't zone for an Apple store and expect Apple to come in and lease, but you can sure prevent things from happening per zoning. So those restrictions always concern me. Major interventions and change in retail, they can happen quickly. There was a period where everybody had a horse and buggy, and then 10 years later, everybody had a car. And there was a time when nobody had a cell phone, and might have been 5 or 10 years later, everybody had a cell phone, and now it's a computer in your pocket. And these scooters were not on the street, and now all of a sudden they're everywhere. So I worry about the regulations, the conditions you have, specific plans, because they take a long time to write and even longer to amend or get rid of. And in that time, things can happen. And if your district is not able to easily adapt, I think you're going to have problems. And I know that's what we see in our community. So I would say, what would shape successful districts in the future is really that ability to be nimble so you can respond to customer demand. I see districts becoming more localized in the future, kind of like what Rob was saying. As we come out of the pandemic, I think it's likely that work habits are going to change for some people. More people will be working from home, probably not want to get in their cars at all. And I could see them becoming more dedicated to serving their community. That's a problem for districts like mine. We rely heavily on our workforce and on UCLA to service our district, but I think Larchmont Village has a built-in advantage of really being able to serve that local community and being somewhat insulated against a big hit like that. Lastly, my takeaways about my visit to Larchmont, I see a lot of advantages. I walked the area last Friday. There were people out, they were dining and having coffee and shopping. I see signs of investment and construction. I did see vacancy, but that wasn't my lasting takeaway of my walk through the district. That's all encouraging. I would say as a negative, and I'm probably using that term too strongly, but I would say as a negative, there could be a greater diversity of uses on the street, and the lack of type 47 alcohol licenses. Like I said, I don't think that's helping your restaurant community. I can give you an example of a really well-known fast casual use in our district. They inherited a space that had a type 47. There was an outrage among a handful of people in the community that threatened to appeal them to death, where it was going to cost them a fortune, so they dropped it. And speaking to the owners of that establishment, their restaurant is making probably 2/5 less of what they thought they were going to make. They opened another store at another location that they thought would not do as well at Westwood Village, and they were wrong. And it's primarily because of the projections around alcohol. So that's a problem for the businesses that come in and can't get it, but it's also a problem for the businesses that they know, and these restaurateurs know each other. And when one asks the other who happens to be in your district, "Hey, what's it like?" And they say, "Oh my God, you wouldn't believe it. I couldn't get alcohol license. There was an uproar." So really, that community is a pain. Maybe I'll look at somewhere else, or maybe I'll go someplace like Santa Monica that's really opened the doors for these kind of businesses and really kind of cleared the decks. I would say the infrastructure, again, agreeing with Rob, I think it's a little tired. The sidewalks are kind of beat, and the trees, the landscaping aren't in great shape. Trees, landscaping, and sidewalks, don't a great district make on their own, but they can sure help. I think some fresh infrastructure investment would be a positive. And the good news is, I don't think it would take much to get there, because you're not talking about a huge area. I think that money could be raised, and sidewalks could be fixed, reconstructed, widened even, and you could plant new trees and really have an area that's very walkable and probably inviting for your businesses to continue to move outside. And then the last point I'll make about an opportunity is, I think the branding could probably be improved. You've got a great district there, and I think you could probably do more to celebrate it, so people have a sense of place when they're there. And I think that could be done with wayfinding signage, monument signage. There's different ways to really announce that you're in a special place. And again, that's not unique to Larchmont. I think many communities in LA have that issue, but I think there's an opportunity to really stand out and celebrate who you are.
Fantastic. Well, that was really incredibly informative, but you did use one technical term, Andrew, that will be my first question, just because I think it's important. Could you explain what a Type 47 alcohol license is?
Sure, that's the license required to sell not just beer and wine, but liquor and spirits as well.
Well, I guess my next question for you on that, and now we've entered into our moderated discussion, which will last about 10 minutes or so. And we're right on time to get everybody out of here at 9 o'clock too. So we'll have plenty of time for the rest of the evening to do this. But my next question has to do with sort of leading from that to, both of you talked a lot about flexibility. Both of you were a little bit concerned about rules and regulations maybe becoming too limiting and not allowing a retail district to adapt fast enough. But I'm wondering, is there any such thing as too much of a good thing? I mean, when you look at these districts, I think there was a lot of wisdom in the way that the queue conditions were written originally, because they looked at it and they said, okay, we want a mix. We don't want this to turn into a business street at the time in which financial and fire uses were like just swallowing up everything they could in a high demographic area. But I think there's a concern that if you loosen things up maybe all the way, that basically the market will just, create 12 coffee shops or 14 bakeries, whatever is the flavor of the day, and that the end result is that we don't end up with the neighborhood-oriented street. So I'm wondering if maybe, Rob, you'd want to comment on, like, at what point is it fair to sort of like think about mix and regulation and things like that?
Well, you do want to think about mix. I think you just don't want to be so heavy-handed about it that you choke off things that you might not have foreseen. I mean, as Andrew says, regulations, it's a long cycle, right? Real estate is a long cycle. You plan your building or you plan your restaurant or whatever, and by the time you get open, things have changed. So I think, probably the best thing that Larchmont Village did not do is say, wow, these few blocks are fantastic. Let's add 5 more blocks, and that's certainly happened in other places. And one of the things we have in the world is, at least in the US, is just way too damn much retail space. And so you have somewhat escaped the worst of that issue. Not that you don't have, you know, more competition popping up, and frankly, rents in some of the competing areas will be dropping. So that puts an overall pressure on the market because, you know, tenants looking at Larchmont Village will be looking at other places. But that's another reason why, you know, you need to create a friendly landing pad for great tenants, and you also have to maintain your physical space. And I agree with Andrew on the branding issue. It's, you know, everybody knows Larchmont Village and knows it exists, and but even some of the core local people maybe have not been there as often or as recently as maybe they should. And so there should be something that defines that space a little bit better. But yeah, I, you know, I have in certain cases supported conditions, mostly to spread out too much of a good thing, right? It, you know, some areas should just be, you know, Bourbon Street, right? You are what you are. Larchmont Village does not need to be that, right? That would be bad. But you want to be a full service street, you know, neighborhood serving, but a full service street to the degree you can do it with that limited space. So I would say you've got a lot of people kind of skating the rules, serving food in a kind of awkward way that's maybe not ideal for the customer or for the business. So there is some rethinking, some loosening of the reins, or some rationalizing of those formulas. And yeah, sometimes when you do that, you know, a landlord or a business doesn't get it the way you hope they get it, but you got to allow for some creativity and some evolution of the space.
Speaking of creativity and evolution of the space, one of the things that you mentioned when you were talking had to do with what you kind of called digitally native retailers. And I wanted to mix that up with something that I know I've heard a lot from people is, are there things that a street like Larchmont can do to maybe understand what a digitally native retailer is, but also to encourage more independent retailers? Because you also talked about that. I mean, is there a way in either of your experience to create conditions that foster some percentage of independent businesses as opposed to, you know, others? Like, I know at one point there was a hardware store. I don't think any of us expect there'll be a hardware store, but on the other hand, it's like it's kind of a missed thing on the street. And there are other, and we know there are certain independent businesses on the street that really are struggling because rents have risen and things like that. But are there things that we could think about that would at least make it a little bit more of a playing field where an independent might consider coming to Larchmont?
So there's a ton of factors. One is support the independents you've got, right? Help those guys survive and thrive in the long haul. And I think if there's a general consensus among the more, you know, enlightened property owners that, you know, we really want to encourage independence and more local serving uses, you know, people get the message eventually. And in some ways you can, you know, point to some independents pay very good rents. You know, it's a little tougher if you've got a steep mortgage or something. It doesn't show as well to the bank. But if, you know, the good news is you've got the right size buildings for independence. I think resolving, which, you know, is the nightmare of being in Los Angeles, is Andrew so adequately, and you know, he's lived it, as we all have. But you got to make it easy for somebody to open, right? You know, I've known a lot of great independents where we've tried to help them through the process, and, you know, something happens, you know, foreseeable or unforeseeable, and they get caught in the loop with planning, or some particular issue comes up, and it takes another 6 months, sometimes an extra year to get the doors open. And even if they open, they're, dead man walking. They've already spent more than they thought they were going to spend. They're often indebted out of day one, and most of these businesses don't make money in the first year. And so their little cushion has evaporated before they get the doors open. So I think there's a whole series of ways in which you can support independent businesses. You're not as big to actually go out and recruit. You have a few brokers, I think, active in the area that maybe have some hustle and can help with that. But the main thing is support the guys you've got and remove the hurdles as much as reasonably possible for independents to come in. Because some of the bigger guys, if they really want to be there, yeah, they can wait it out. They'll write the check, they'll sit there, they'll eventually get open, and they may or may not be the right use.
I add to that, John?
Sure, go ahead.
So my thought about independent businesses is most independent businesses probably dream of having multiple locations. To them that's success. At one point there was only one Starbucks. At one point, I don't know this for a fact, there's probably only one Salt and Straw. You've got one now. I would like one in my district. My daughter, we live in Culver City. She goes to that one all the time and loves it with her friends, and it's a huge asset in our community. But at one point, that's one time a business is independent, the next time it's not. So I worry about adding language that would limit chains, because what number is right? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 100? Because businesses can blow up quickly if they're successful, and then all of a sudden you're telling Salt and Straw, no, you can't come in. You're too successful for us.
And the truth is that certain communities have tried to do exactly that, and it's been difficult. I have a question for you, Andrew, which has to do, you said one of the things that you thought was most important was to get everybody on one page. And I know that in Westwood, since I worked with you a little bit there, that the getting people on one page has been one of your biggest challenges, that the HOAs that you mentioned have not always seen eye to eye with UCLA, who has not always seen eye to eye with the landowners, who have not always seen eye to eye with the tenants. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit for a minute or two about some of the efforts that you've made to get people on one page, to build a consensus, and because I know that you've lately had some success in being able to come forward to the city with unified proposals for Westwood Village.
Yeah, it's. I wish there was an easy way to through it. I'll tell you what I tell my board members is that my slogan is, every day we fight for inches, because it feels like that's what we have to do to move the needle in any way on these big issues that require some type of consensus in the community. I'd say that the first thing is to understand that you're never going to make everybody happy. And there are going to be people that don't want to see change for whatever reason. In our district, it's because change symbolized noise, traffic, and maybe negative activity. The village used to be the place. 40 years ago, that was the place. If you wanted to see a first run movie, you could either take your life in your hands and go to Hollywood, or you could come to Westwood Village, and people would come from all over the region to visit, and people cruise and they walk shoulder to shoulder on the sidewalks, and it was the place. But it got to be a little too much, and the specific plan was drafted, and at that point the pendulum went from here all the way to the other side. And I'm just trying to see how can we create a community and a special place that works for everyone. In terms of getting people together, understanding you're never going to get everyone, how can you get your vision across to most people where it becomes the shared vision for your community? I really think that's just so crucial. And you have to take your story to the people. And I think an event like this one is a great opportunity. To me, and I say this as somebody who works, directly for property owners, essentially, or developers, decisions that are made in boardrooms and conference rooms or living rooms are not always serving the public, and usually are not. And that's not what good public policy is about. Good public policy should be done, in daylight, through a process which we all know is time consuming and cumbersome, but it's really the only way to do it to make sure everybody is heard. So, in Westwood, our council member was questioning whether or not there was a real feeling in our district to amend our specific plan with his blessing, and we had him write our intro. We sent out a survey, and it was we had over 2,500 respondents in a pretty short amount of time. So it was the most successful survey we've ever had, and it came back overwhelmingly supportive of change. And I think the numbers even blew him away. And so he agreed to put forth amendments to our specific plan. We started a letter writing campaign, and over 400 people submitted letters in support of amending the specific plan. And then we brought people to the public hearing, and it was 25-3, I think, in support of seeing amendments passed. So I think if ultimately the people will speak, and it's just reaching them, which can be a challenge because the folks who attend a lot of public meetings might have a lot of free time and a special level of engagement that other folks don't have. So getting them to commit to a shared vision is important. The last thing I'll say is that we've recently engaged with an architecture firm. It's done a lot of big projects in the city, and they've created for us a vision of what Westwood Village could be, and it's spectacular. And we had a big public meeting presenting it, and this is the beginning. It's the first step in a process, but our hope is that if people can rally around that vision, then we can change the conditions in our specific plan and whatever zoning comes next for us, so we can allow for this vision to be a reality. But we're really trying to paint the picture so people can see it and have it be easy to understand so they can get on board. So again, I would say understand you're never going to get everyone, but reach out to everyone and try to get as many people involved as possible.
And one last question before we open it up. Could you describe just a little bit more what your restaurant beverage program is and how it works?
Sure. It's not ours. It was actually introduced by LA City Planning. And initially it began as this effort to allow for restaurants to be able to get their permit to serve alcohol over the counter. So without having to go through a discretionary process or get a CUB to serve alcohol. It's unfortunately, at least in my view, the restaurant beverage program has been watered down since it was initially introduced. There are many restrictions on it, to the point where I think there are going to be a lot of restaurants that pass on it. It'll probably help, smaller, maybe quick serve, like a burrito place or something, sell beer and wine. But it won't help your restaurants that want to sell alcohol, because the full bar alcohol was removed from the restaurant beverage program because, and this is one of my pet peeves, there's a feeling that you can get more drunk on alcohol than you can on hard alcohol than beer and wine. You can get equally drunk on both. So it's if your concern is people abusing alcohol, alcohol is alcohol. Hard alcohol is not really different than beer and wine. It drinks a drink. So the RBP has been watered down significantly, but it is working its way through City Council. It's actually before Council on Wednesday. So I'm hopeful it goes through, because that'll at least be a foot in the door. It won't allow LA to compete with Santa Monica. That's basically said everybody in, full bar, for all, and you still have to go through the ABC process with the state, but at least it's simpler there. So this will be an important step for the city of LA to take, but it's not going to get us where I think we need to be.
Okay, well, with that, I think it's really important that we open it up to everybody. I'm going to turn it back over to Heather and Gary. I haven't really had the chance to read all the comments because I've been trying to concentrate on taking notes and talking to you. But Heather, Gary,
we've been trying to do
go with
both.
it.
Yeah, we've tried to do both as well, because they've been answering a number of questions that we've been asking ourselves for a few months now. So there are about 4 or 5 questions, and I'll just go in order. Is Jana Harris? Do you want to unmute and ask your question, or should I just repeat it, your call? If you're still here.
Yeah, I'm here. My question for Rob was, you mentioned the corners on Larchmont. I was just wondering what you would like to see there ideally. What type of occupant?
I haven't really thought through. I just think it's they're bigger chunks of real estate, and frankly, they're uses that aren't super additive to the character or the mix of uses. So I would just start to think about what would be allowed to be built there, what the mixes are, again, maybe, down the road, there's flexibility to create, some setbacks to where you can have some outdoor dining on key corners, or, what uses would be allowed on a second level. You have to think about the economics of what might get built there. Do you still need parking in 20 years? We don't know, but I think it's worth starting to think about it, because I do, between the banks and the dry cleaner and Chipotle, and it just, your entry points are pretty weak.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Conrad Starr. Conrad, you still here to ask about the alleys?
Yes, I am here. Thank you, Gary. Well, I wanted to ask about the alleys, and then, of course, I've come up with a number of other questions since then. So, being that there is that alley just to the west of Larchmont between First and Beverly, and I think it extends north a little bit, or it reappears, wonder if there are any specific recommendations for perhaps a better use of that alley. But if, Gary, may I ask another question as well?
Sure.
I'm just wondering about programming of daytime versus nighttime, or sort of curating the street as we're having this moment of re-envisioning. How do you balance daytime and nighttime uses? I grew up in Pasadena. I watched as Old Town Pasadena turned from a derelict, place you'd never want to go, to a very vibrant destination, particularly Saturday or Friday through Sunday. And as a youth, we didn't have a lot of money to spend, but we really liked to go there. And I'd say we could take some credit for the buzz that was created, fostered by the attraction, for the youth. And now, with rents being perhaps more expensive than they were when a record store might be able to move in, I just wonder, how do you serve multiple generations, multiple age groups that may not all be spending the same amount of money, but maybe creating the environment that you're looking for? And then how do you balance that from daytime uses during the week to nighttime uses and weekend uses? Thanks.
Sure. I think you have a huge nighttime opportunity in the village. I think it's, like a number of districts, the sidewalks kind of roll up at a given hour. I think, broadening and upgrading your mix of food and beverage, and having some full liquor, not a ton, but having some of it there will change that nature. And once you have a critical mass of activity, some of the existing businesses will stay open later. So there is some programming. There's certainly lighting, making sure perception is everything. I think you have a very safe district, but let's make sure nobody questions that in terms of, how it's lit, and, any maintenance issues that might, lead to a question about, is this okay to be here at this hour? Can I walk home from here at this hour? So I think, and certainly there's some programming. I think there's some very successful things I've seen other places. Certainly around holidays, having extended hours and kind of an open house environment, and really focus on locals, or having a, Thursday night, try and get as many retailers to add an extra hour or two in the evening that they don't normally do, or, just something where people can come out and stroll. And frankly, as half of it is seeing your neighbors or somebody new and different just out in the environment. It's hard to serve multiple generations. You don't have a tremendous amount of space, but certainly being family friendly, being pet friendly is huge these days. So think about that. But things that seem like an extravagance, but are actually affordable luxuries, people will pay for. They'll pay for that ridiculously expensive ice cream cone or that cup of coffee if they're sitting in a cool environment and interesting people are walking along. So I think, it's just making sure there's a critical mass of activity without, and I don't see a real risk of it in Larchmont, but there are places that have, kind of tipped over and you don't want to operate at 120% for too long.
I would
Okay.
say for the alleys, I could so Conrad,
I
I know
skipped that on purpose.
Thank you. Conrad, I know Pasadena a little bit, and I know that's Don Shoup, who's a UCLA legend. That's one of his examples he cites all the time, is how parking money really reformed that district because of the reinvestment in the parking structures there, and just how the local bid there is particularly flush because of the parking meter money that they receive. But their alleys, I think, are a terrific case study. I don't know how utilitarian those alleys are versus or were versus your alleys. If the Larchmont alleys, if they're, is there an opportunity to convert those, or are they dumpsters everywhere and the trash trucks are driving through constantly? I think if you can shift that infrastructure out of there, you have an opportunity to bring in some cool uses that would probably pay a little less rent, that may be appealing to other generations as well. But I couldn't speak to it without really looking at it.
Yeah, that's a very case by case. There's some great alleys where, hey, I want to spend time here, and most of them are dumpsters and really the guts of the business district.
Okay, then the questions are coming in heavily now, which is great. BB Johnson, BB, if you're still here, I know you'd like to speak.
Hi. Mostly I've lived in the neighborhood 25 years, and I know that there were a couple of seismic shifts, one of which was when one person in particular, maybe two people, bought a bunch of buildings all around the same time frame, and the rents didn't go up in any kind of typical way. We lost a lot of people because the rents went up like 4 or 5 times. People who were paying $3,000 were being asked to pay $12,000 for. So a lot of these buildings are now newly owned with, or relatively newly owned with, I'm sure, much higher mortgages. How do you bring in independence, or stay away from chain stores? Because even as much as I like what they did in Old Town Pasadena, it is now all, it's a mall. It's turned into, it doesn't have interesting retailers anymore. So I don't know how you manage the needs of the building owners who now have really big mortgages and expect there to be no limits on what retailers can pay. Like, I don't know how you find people to, fill. I mean, I look at Robertson Boulevard, so that's my concern. Is I really like the small independent retailers who are bringing in unusual things, because those aren't something you experience on Amazon. How do you help them pay for that?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. I have to say, once the building basis has been reset, a lot of the flexibility goes out the window, and that's where you need to, it becomes that you have to slice it a little finer and look at, well, maybe it's more unique or relatively rare retail versus truly independent retail, right? Because there are some very cool online retailers who are now opening, bricks and mortar stores, both to build their brand, but also to, learn about their customers. And frankly, for some of those, not that, everybody's goal in life is to ratchet up the rents to the highest number possible, because that ultimately will cost you, unfortunately. But some of those, which are truly interesting, unique, small destinations, rent is not the driving factor in how they choose a place. So again, you have to make sure that, you're a place that has many reasons to be chosen. The other thing is, to be honest, there are independents that can pay a real rent. I mean, a shockingly high rent. And again, you start to exclude some of the field for sure. But if you're a high performing district, rising rents are inevitable. And I think you just have to, some landlords are very interested and focused on having independence, and others are looking to maximize their return. I think there's some areas of overlap, but it's always going to be a challenge. But I think given the sizing and some of the older ownerships, you're going to have a mix there. I think the good news is your spaces don't preclude independence.
I have a question that I just didn't want to skip myself. It was really for Andrew, that Andrew mentioned a number of times that it's the destination, it's the destination. So aside from restaurants, what would be other destinations that we could consider here in Larchmont that would go along with this new branding?
Sure. I think, I mean, it was said already, but really these, unique boutique retail destinations, I think is what, will be the mix, between sort of food and experiential uses. And you have some already. I about fell over when I walked by a bookstore. I haven't seen a live bookstore in a very long time. So that was extremely cool. So I think it's uses, smaller uses like that kind of boutique, destination retail, the kind of things that make Larchmont Village a special place to visit. I see those sort of filling in some of the holes around probably more food uses, and then the uses that you have to visit, and that's, I think, like Rob mentioned, some of these, a gym, and it's not a huge place, maybe it's a smaller gym, or I've seen some smaller uses like that, but the kind of places that you actually have to walk to and experience. And those places, they have a synergy when it's all working, and you'll see the hours start to shift for other businesses surrounding it. So the restaurant comes in, they're open till 10 or 11. Maybe the retailer will stay open now until 9 instead of closing their doors at 5 or 5:30. So I think especially in a smaller, sort of setting like you have, I think you have an opportunity to really fill in some of the holes with these uses that can also fill in these smaller spaces. And I'm envious because in Westwood we have depths that go 100 feet or more, and it's a disaster for our owners to try to lease those spaces. So you actually have the ability to lease to these smaller independent uses.
Great.
I think that, Gary, can I just
Sure.
chime in here that I think it's important in this conversation to recognize what's happening with the Center for Yoga coming back and working with the property owner. And do you want to talk about that? Or Diana, do you want to talk about that for a minute to everybody?
Sure. Yes, we're very excited that we're bringing back the Center for Yoga. We were able to negotiate a great deal with our landlord with a lease for the place, which is terrific because they were very excited to have local neighbors bringing this sort of iconic space back. And it's very exciting. The neighborhood has been really supportive and excited about it coming back. And so this is this is a locally owned business that's coming back onto the street. I don't know what else to say, except we're very excited, and there'll be more coming about when it's opening, but it'll be late summer.
But it's also been a lot of work on your part. So congratulations to you and the people who've done it.
Yes, the main people, I'm not the driving force of it, but they've done it. I mean, it's been a real collaborative effort. It's very exciting.
That's a great success story, and that will help. There's certain types of apparel and certain types of food and other things that are obviously benefit from having that kind of use.
But can I say something? You mentioned the bookstore. Bert Deixler's on this, I think. That bookstore was saved because he and his partner came in and bought that bookstore, or it was not going to survive. So this is another one of those wonderful local stories, but it's because people in the community said, we can't let this gem go. Mm-hmm. And otherwise we've lost restaurants, we've lost all these other markets I was putting in the chat because people can't afford the rents unless somebody kind of swoops in and saves them. So I think it's a big problem. It's nice to say that specialty stores should come in, but many of them can't afford to stay there unless there's someone who will come in and help save them.
Hey, thank you. And thanks for the yoga too. I'm excited. Philip Farha has a question. Philip? Philip still here? It's going to be hard to read.
I'm here.
There you go.
Here we go. All right. Sorry about that. My question really was, what's the purpose of a modern street, a modern community street in the age of Amazon? In this, is it shopping? Is shopping even important? Is retail even really important? I mean, it's great to see it. We have on Sycamore, we have a new vinyl record store, which is lovely to see. It's really cool. We have an optometrist, but they're very, very fancy, and they're not exactly the thing that people are decrying or missing, which is, you know, the good old affordable neighborhoody type stores. Are those important to the fabric, and are there examples, you know, or is there a ratio that works really well in some of the examples that you've seen where you say, okay, this is the food ratio independent? Or is the future just really about community? Is it about going out and seeing people and doing the one thing that we can't do on Amazon or on FaceTime or Zoom or anything like that, which is be together? So maybe that's the real purpose of a neighborhood street. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Andrew, you want to take that?
I think you hit it on the head, Philip, talking about community, because I love where I live and being able to walk to my downtown, and you don't know what you'll see or expect, and so much of that is about the people and being outside and terrific climate. I mean, I think you know, great places are made up of great destinations and great characters and great communities, and I think that they're real and authentic, and I think that's, you know, a huge advantage that Larchmont Village has, I think that Westwood Village has, is that these are authentic places. They're not fake, and, you know, and no disrespect to the fake place down the road, you know, but, you know, they were designed after places like Larchmont, you know, these sort of, you know, these original outdoor communities where people came together, and I think people want to be there and businesses want to open there. So I get it about the rents, but I also think that that you don't undersell it. You know, there's a demand, and I think people want to be a part of your community, and are willing to pay. And yeah, it might not be easy for all, but I think that you have enough spaces, or a limited number of spaces where there still is going to be some demand to fill them.
Yeah, and just to kind of follow on there, it is about community, right? People want to be out, they want to see other people, they want to meet friends and neighbors, and yeah, there are practical uses and services and things that people need and want and can get in the village, but you know, the more people spend time there, the more there's going to be food and retail sales, and, you know, more curiosity about what's coming in a certain place. I would say one thing that's hard for people, because, you know, there's something that's been there 20 years and they love it and it's affordable, and it goes out, and, you know, businesses, especially small businesses, they rotate, and that's part of the lifeblood of a district. I mean, it's always sad when you lose a business, but you don't know that next business coming in that you've never heard of might be the next generation's thing that they love and the reason they come to your village. So you have to let the place evolve. I would also say, in terms of the affordability issue, it might be a secret to some people on this call, but your neighborhood is not an inexpensive neighborhood, right? The demographics are extremely strong. It's a wealthy enclave, you know, and yes, there's some diversity there, but I think most of the people looking at the area are going to drive through the neighborhoods and say, okay, I can sell this kind of food and I can sell this kind of clothes, and, you know, they can run a report, but you don't have to think about it too hard to understand some elements of the customer base in Larchmont.
Perfect. Okay, I've got another question directly for Andrew from Jill Bernheimer. I'll just read it for time. How long from start to finish do you expect changing those conditions in Westwood will take?
What a great question. Well, let's see, I'm throwing in the pandemic because that I think affected time, but we made our initial recommendations in 2017. We've been talking about it for years, but the initial recommendations went to the city in 2017 and 2018. We finally got the city to commit to doing a report back. So the motion was introduced for the city staff to put together, a community sort of feedback as to what might be required. That took about a year. The pandemic hit, everything went, sort of hit the pause button. They've recently restarted where we had the public hearing. We expect to go to Planning Commission in the next, hopefully 3 or 4 months, and then it'll go to the Planning and Land Use Management Committee of City Council and full City Council. So I'm hopeful that we're at the finish line. I mean, I've been telling people, cross your fingers for the end of this calendar year, but it might bleed into next year. So I guess about a 5-year process, start to finish. But had the pandemic not hit, maybe it would have been 4.
And the sad part, Westwood Village is, those conditions were out of date the day they came in. And that was what, the late 80s, right? They were fighting the last war, and people got entrenched around, unfortunately, the wrong issues. And the village in Westwood has suffered, and it's been a long, painful process, which I feel for Andrew, but there's lots of upside there. So
okay, we have officially 10 minutes left, and we're going to try to keep to it. So there are a number of questions about Larchmont north of Beverly, and we've discussed this amongst ourselves, and there are separate regulations, and we're going to be addressing that separately. And we thought the purpose of this was to begin on south. So no one's ignoring them. It's just a matter of process, and we will get to that at some point. But there is a lot of conversation. So I want to hear from Larry Guzin right away, because we want to talk a little more about alcohol while we can. Larry? Or should I read your question? Mr. Guzin?
Oh, Larry does not have a microphone, it appears. So maybe, Gary, you should read the question, because it also follows, I think, a similar question that somebody else asked about. It's kind of my question of, is there such thing as, is too much of anything a good thing? But go ahead.
Okay, I'll read it now. Great. Can you share your opinions on any public peace and public safety downsides to Windsor Square residents, particularly residing on adjacent single-family streets, to on-site hard liquor sales until midnight in a historically family-oriented district that has been limiting restaurants to on-site beer and wine sales only until 10 p.m.? How can on-site hard liquor sales until midnight be limited, as every competing Larchmont Village restaurant will want this? How does Larchmont Village not have a ton, as you say? He really asks, I can paraphrase it, but I think it's pretty clear.
I can respond quickly. Listen, there are bad actors. I think everybody knows that. That's why LAPD has a vice division that goes in and does sting operations and these things. I will say, and I've learned a lot about this just in my community, is that the serving of alcohol has changed a lot over the years, and the penalties for businesses, the cost of getting an alcohol license, the cost of losing it, the penalties that can be imparted on these businesses for violating the rules are very, very severe. So I feel like businesses are highly motivated to make sure that they don't overserve people, they don't serve underage people. I feel like it's a different time now. That said, I know they're bad actors here, but would those bad actors look at Larchmont Village as a place where they wanted to open? That part I'm not sure. They may be looking for, a community that has, like a college town place, like they might be looking to open at Westwood, but they may not be looking at your community. My short answer.
Okay. And there's a follow-up from Jane Usher. Jane, if you're still here, can you unmute, please?
So I think I'm unmuted. Hi, Gary. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So my question for us has been, as it relates to full alcohol, since we're not owned by a single enterprise, as Rob pointed out early in the evening, how do you award full alcohol to 1 or 2 operators? and not be forced by the city under an equal protection or similar argument to award the same rights and privileges to every restaurant? How do you limit it?
I think you can place conditions to where you would only get, a small number, and you tie it to, the right kind of operations, the right kind of size, the mix of sales, alcohol versus food. There's a lot of conditions you can put on it. On a more generic chain basis, the kind of generic use I would say is something like a small Hillstone, which I mentioned earlier. If you go to the R&D kitchen in Santa Monica, it's a place you can go any night of the week. It's not cheap, but they have a full bar. Nobody's stumbling out the door inebriated, and it's just part of the dining experience. So if you want to have higher end, high quality dining, very few of them can make it on just some beer and wine service. It's an expensive, low margin, high capital investment business. I think the neighborhood deserves a couple of better dining options.
So Rob,
yeah.
I understand that completely. I just want a precedent where it's lawful in the city of LA to restrict the number that get the privilege.
Well, I'm wondering if, going back to the original genius of the Q conditions, what I hear everybody saying tonight, or I shouldn't say everybody, what I hear both Rob and Andrew saying is that one of the big things I'm taking away from this meeting tonight is that we have to have a conversation about what does flexibility mean, and so one of the questions in my mind really has to do with, well, are there ways that you can take some of the existing Q conditions, which do talk about limitations on the total amount of frontage, et cetera, and sort of use those to your advantage to explore more flexibility, but at the same time maintain certain amount of control. I mean, I think there was a certain brilliance to the way the thinking existed in 1992, but at the same time, it's 30 years later. And I think what I'm taking away from this is that you're encouraging us to at least have a conversation about looking back on to what extent are we solving the issue that we want to solve right now the way it is, and to what an issue are we precluding opportunities, and is that okay? I mean, maybe it's okay to leave it just the way it is. Maybe it's not, but I don't know that we know the answer to that, but I'm just wondering if some of those tools give us a little bit of insight on how to get there.
Thanks, John.
I want to make sure we get to this first. Heather, you might be able to answer. There's a lot of questions about Mercantile, about the Christina. So for those of you who don't know, there's 14 stores going in on the east side of Larchmont, and we don't know. So people are asking what's happening. So whatever you could share with us from the bid would be helpful now.
Well, sure. I don't have too much information because they haven't really announced what is going on there. We do know that they're not doing massive renovations. And they don't really have a complete timeline, nor have they shared any of the potential tenants with us. But let's hope that maybe we can have an update for our next meeting on placemaking.
Great. Okay, and as long as we have Heather, is Oriel still here? Oriel Spiegel, because your question is going to be directly would be answered by Heather.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. Thanks, Heather. Thank you everybody for doing this. This is really helpful. And I was not completely aware of everything. I grew up here. My entire family lives here. I remember when they put the Blockbuster in, and it was the community that came around and insisted that that facade remain in line with the rest of Larchmont. And that was a big deal to have the Blockbuster come in. So my biggest question really, as we're talking about all this, and I think, thank you to Rob and Andrew, I think we're a little bit more unique than Westwood in that we're smaller, and we also back right up, like the neighborhoods back right up to our alleyways. So when we're talking about second floors or the use of alleyways and the increase of restaurants and chains, more importantly, we're talking about people that might not, the more chains we have, the less tendency there is, from what I understand, to join Larchmont Boulevard Association, contribute to trash pickup, higher amounts of rats leads to all of these issues. So really it comes down to, as we're trying to future-proof some of this stuff and still want to attract people and attract tenants, is understanding really the people that do own the buildings right now, what is their kind of willingness to work with the community? They're obviously in a business, they're here to make money. That's capitalism. We all understand that. But in thinking about future proofing, if there isn't sort of a care in that sense with working with the community, I would imagine that sort of impacts the thought process in terms of what kind of restrictions are put in. Because if it's lift all restrictions, don't restrict it, then we might be shooting ourselves in the foot. So I'm just curious how they're in working and knowing that there are various building owners. What is the general sort of sense, or is it a mixed bag in that, in terms of willingness to work and caring about the community?
Right. Well, there's 24 property owners on Larchmont. Some of them live in the community. Some of them don't. Some of them have owned the properties for years and years. Some of them have just, purchased the property. So everybody has a different situation. But what I can say about the property owners is that, for example, during COVID was really an example of, I would say, more property owners than not really worked with their tenants and made it work. I think that even talking about the yoga space coming back, that's a direct example of a property owner wanting a neighborhood use to come in and, negotiating a rent that they could do. So I think that there's a misconception in our community about the property owners. And I think the reason is it kind of came at the same time. There was a kind of a couple of things that happened at the same time. I think that, look, our housing prices went way up. When I bought my first little house here, it was for very little, and that same house, now is $1.5 million. So our values went up, and then also kind of at that same time was the rise of people purchasing online and people kind of changing the way they shop. So, and, purchasing the new buildings with a higher mortgage. So it's kind of a little bit of everything. But I can say that the property owners are really invested in the neighborhood. And most of them say that Larchmont is their favorite, they love Larchmont. They get the importance of this moment now, which is why really it was the property owners that kind of wanted to have this conversation too, because they really wanted everybody to come together and have the conversation. So it was important for us to bring in the community, to bring in the merchants, so that, everybody can kind of have a voice in what we want Larchmont to be, because it's such a special community and we want to protect that and keep that.
Maybe that's a perfect segue, since it's 9:00, into I'm trying to wrap things up, and I'm going to share my screen again.
John, can I interrupt just for a second? John Wellborn had his hand up for a long time. And
I'm sorry.
John was not in the chat, and I saw it too late, and I think no Larchmont conversation would be complete without hearing from John. So if John—
Gary, thank you. I was just going to say, there's a very generous offer in the chat, since many of the questions are about owners. And David Ashkenazi has volunteered to talk a little bit about that, since he represents a lot of them. That was all I was going to say. Thank you.
Oh.
Well, I'm perfectly, that would be great if David wants to contribute. Sure. Should we let David be the last open forum speaker?
And maybe, John, we can have you stop sharing and I can go back and
Also, John, we want to make it clear to everyone that we are going to go back and read the chat and see every question that is there, and we'll get back. We have everyone's email, and we know most of the people, and we will make sure everything gets answered. I promise. Okay, David.
Hi. Firstly, thank you to our speakers here. This is very informative. I have a million questions that I won't bore everyone with now, but maybe I'll shoot you both emails at some point to ask them. Topics came up a number of times as it relates to owners and will they participate and so forth. And I do think that there is a level of enthusiasm to do so. At the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to money. It's just the nature of the beast. But I do have some ideas that I think are far-fetched, and I think that it's going to be tough to accomplish. But a lot of what can be done to bring independence back and to bring good tenants to the street, it just takes money. And I think what's unfortunately, the dynamics of it has always come down to the owners, whether that's the bid cleaning up the trees, whether that's the bid, picking up the trash. And listen, they're the property owners, they should. But if the property owners are going to have the full cost of doing all this, they're going to want to achieve rents that will stop certain people from being able to open up businesses. I do agree with Rob and Andrew, who say that there are independents who can pay these sort of rents. There certainly are, but it's scary for them. It's scary to invest in a business on the street where the rents are really high. So one of the suggestions I made in the chat, and to be honest, I thought of it as we were talking now, I never thought of it before, but giving some of these guys grants to open up these businesses, to give it a shot. So they're not risking their life to do so. And where does that money come from? I think ownership in the street, the property owners should participate, but I think the community should participate. The community wants these people. These people will benefit from the community. There could be a money raised amongst the community to fund these grants. And, I'm no expert in the structure of how this is done, but is it a tax? I don't think anyone's going to want that. Is it, a charity that we collect? I don't know who runs this sort of thing, but all this comes down to money. There's some good suggestions were made by Rob and Andrew to do more events on the street. And I really think to make a difference, it can't just be that holiday event. It can't just be that once a year, once a quarter neighborhood, block party. It's got to be something that occurs weekly. I spend a lot of time in Israel, and they're going through the same sort of retail problems that we're going through. And one of the things that they've done in their malls mostly is that they have magicians or singers or entertainment in the mall on the street constantly. Every afternoon there's a kids entertainer entertaining the kids, or constant things. And these are not big time celebrities. These are local people that may cost a little bit, may cost nothing, but it takes also people to organize this. It's a full-time job, and I don't know who's going to run that. So there's a lot of different things that can be done. It comes down to effort, and it comes down to money. But the owners will participate to a certain extent. And doing all these things, it's an investment because in theory, all this works. People drive customers spend money, rents can be supported. So I don't have all the answers, and I don't want to sound like the huge landlord advocate that my profession requires me to be, but I agree with Heather that they do get a bad rap, and there is effort to do so. But I think if we are truly going to be a community, the effort and the cost needs to be borne by all of us. And if people aren't willing to spend that money and that effort, they have they're going to have to deal with what the owners need to do to make it work.
Well, David, I think that we have to wrap up, but I think that you're providing a perfect segue into not only sort of some of the challenges and conclusions tonight, but also why we have a second session on placemaking, where we hope to look at some of these things that both Rob and Andrew, who I thank tremendously for coming here tonight, raised as issues. But it's not just the retail mix, but it's also the programming, the destination qualities. I thought Rob made a lot of great suggestions about making maybe some of the parklets permanent to create the outdoor street. There were some comments that came from folks in the neighborhood. I think Larry raised that question about, or no, it wasn't Larry, it was somebody else, about the community space becoming key to making the retail work. So our next session, I'm going to share my screen here as a way of moving on and wrapping up so that everyone can finish up. I think you can see my screen now, right? Is on July 12th. We're going to be talking about Main Street placemaking. We've got two great folks coming in from further afield than Los Angeles. Howard Blackson is located down in San Diego and has spent the last 30 years working on exactly these types of problems from a physical design standpoint or an urban design standpoint. He now has a consulting business called Howard Blackson 21st Century Urbanism, and he's been at the forefront of some really interesting neighborhood street programs down there. And we're really incredibly fortunate, and I want to thank John Wellborn for the initial introduction, that we were lucky enough to get Lindsay Wallace from Main Street America Institute, which is a kind of offshoot of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They run one of the most important and successful programs in the United States, which has developed programs to do some of the types of things that, David, you were talking about just a moment ago throughout the country. And she's going to speak to some of these types of initiatives that you were mentioning. So I'm really looking forward to that as well, and we hope you'll all come. And then on the 26th of July, that's going to be our opportunity. We're not sure how we're going to do it yet, but we're going to try to have an open forum where we start to share ideas like we're starting to do tonight, get a giant list of thoughts, maybe have a little bit of debate back and forth about how to balance the pros and cons of some of the things that we're talking about. And then from there, I think we're going to expand our conversation and try to come up, and this is important, I think, for Patty, Gary, and Heather and I, to some sort of tackle some of the short-term opportunities. Like, we don't want to get caught in thinking we have to change the entire world with a totally new plan or something like that, because we recognize that, we don't want to be here for 5 years. We want to see if we can come up with some ideas that we can get going quicker than that. So to conclude, stay in touch, come on the 12th and on the 26th. We're posting things at larchmont2021.com. Like, if you really want to read the queue conditions, you can find them there. Patty mentioned in the chat an article about some really interesting programs in Great Britain where they're trying to support local users. That's posted there. We'll put updates there. You can register for the next sessions. If you have something very specific to say, in addition to where we are right now, send your comments to Patty at larchmontbuzz.com. And with that, I'll just say we hope to see you on the 12th. We hope to see you on the 28th. And thank you and good night. And thank you, Rob and Andrew. It was really terrific seeing you even here on Zoom. And thank you so much for contributing to our community.
Thanks, everyone.
They won't leave. There's 28 people. We're too compelling. They just won't leave. Who's here?